In May 1940, Adolf Hitler launched one of the most famous military offensives in history, and soon enough, the German blitzkrieg had brought the French state to its knees. Parallel to this, in the south, Mussolini launched an offensive of his own in early June. This offensive lasted a mere 2 weeks, and resulted in an essentially unmitigated disaster for the Italians. This front, however, is rarely mentioned, and even when it is essentially skimmed over. Let's find out what actually happened when Benito Mussolini threw his army into the Alps without artillery or aviation support against the most modern fortifications in the world. 2 things before we begin. Firstly, this video is entirely a work of history, and it is in no way, shape, or form political. Please use common sense. Secondly, I'd like to give a big thank you to those of you who support me on Patreon, Subscribestar, or YouTube itself. Without these kind of subscriptions, I simply would not be able to make these videos for a living, and I cannot thank you enough. If you aren't a member and do wish to support the channel, join our Discord or our weekly Paradox games, then please do consider clicking one of the links in the description. Thank you. When the Second World War first broke out, Italy reneged on their alliance, although not to the degree that they had done in the First World War. The Italians had explained to the Germans that they would not be ready for war until the early to mid-1940s, but regardless, they had signed on the dotted line and agreed to join Germany's wars, whether they were offensive or defensive. When Germany was about to invade Poland, however, the Italians unloaded a list of supplies that they would need as a prerequisite for them to join the war on Germany's side, fulfilling their agreement. Ciano, the Italian foreign minister, said that the list, quote, would kill a bull if he could read it, end quote. The list was ridiculous, and that was the point. The supplies would have taken 17,000 trains of 50 wagons each to transport them, 7 million tons of gasoline, 1 million tons of wood, 150,000 tons of copper, 22,000 tons of rubber, and 10,000 tons of lead were just a few of the items on the list. The Germans, quite rightly, were furious. In their eyes, it was the Great War all over again. Hitler, however, kept things amicable, and Italy got her way. On the 7th of December 1939, the British decided that all goods of German origin were now contraband, regardless of their current owner, in a clear breach of maritime law. This cut off Italy's supply of essential German coal, and Mussolini warned Churchill, quote, "These measures will force Italy into the arms of Germany," end quote. The Duce went on to say that Britain was responsible for what he called, quote, "the true and real slavery in which Italy found herself in its own sea," end quote. 6 days later, the Grand Council of Fascism decided that Italy would now no longer be a neutral, but a non-belligerent. This meant that the Italians favoured the Germans, but were not yet in the war. Throughout these months, however, it was by no means clear that Italy would march off to war. The people, and most of the government, were staunchly against it. Most Italians hated Germans, and some openly wanted the Allies to win. The Pact of Steel was more a pact between 2 men, Hitler and Mussolini, than a pact between 2 nations. The Duce himself didn't even particularly like Hitler, and was furiously envious of his success. In March he would remark, quote, "How humiliating it is to sit with your arms folded, while others go down in history. In order to make a nation great, one must push it into battle, even with kicks in the backside," end quote. In late March, Duce and Führer met at the Brenner Pass, and Mussolini stated his desire to join the war. By now, however, Hitler was against such an idea. He considered operations in the Alps to be impossible, and he was quite right. In Italy too, the mood was still not yet right for war. This, however, changed on the 10th of May, when the Germans invaded France. Success was quickly forthcoming, and a sense of fear of missing out swept the nation. The war, it seemed, would soon be over, and Italy would be left on the sidelines, unable to reap the rewards. This was the golden opportunity if Italy wanted to seize the French lands they coveted, these being Nice, Corsica, Tunisia, and Djibouti. In late May, in order to keep the Italians out of the war, the French offered to open up negotiations regarding some of these territories. Mussolini, however, refused. The Duce's attitude at this point is summed up in the now infamous words he uttered to Marshal Badoglio, quote, "Mr. Marshal, I only need a few thousand dead to sit at the peace table as a fighting party," end quote. By late May, the Italians were preparing for war. The chiefs of staff knew that Italy was horribly underprepared for any such undertaking, but the assumption was that the war would be an extremely quick one. After all, France was on the verge of collapse, and very few at the time expected Britain to fight on as she did. The Duce planned to join on the 5th of June, but Hitler advised a slight delay, and so the date that changed Italian history forever was to be the 10th. That day, at 6 p.m, the balcony doors of the Palazzo Venezia swung open, and the Duce came out to address his people. Quote, "Soldiers on land, at sea, and in the air, black shirts of the revolution and legions, men and women of Italy, the empire and the kingdom of Albania. Listen, the hour of destiny has come over our country, the hour of irreversible decisions. The declaration of war has already been delivered to the ambassadors of Great Britain and France. We are entering the fight against the reactionary and plutocratic Western democracies that have always hampered progress and have often threatened the existence of the Italian nation. In our case, because a nation of 45 million is not really free until it has free access to the oceans." End quote. The Italians were now at war, and despite France's impending collapse, there still remained the formidable Alps to overcome. Clausewitz had considered such an operation absolutely unrealistic in the past, and in the Central Powers era, any such idea of attacking France from this direction had been dismissed. Now, however, Italy would attempt the impossible against both the harshest terrain and strongest fortifications on the planet. In Army Group West, as it was known, there were 12,605 officers, 299,339 NCOs and other ranks, and 2,949 artillery pieces. In reality, however, many of these men were in reserve, and so only around 133,000 Italian troops had a real share in the upcoming campaign. The artillery, too, could not be counted on once the Italian infantry marched into the mountains. This posed quite the issue, as in those mountains laid the French fortifications, and the Italians had no troops specifically trained for the task of assaulting such positions. On top of this, the Italians had been in defensive positions, not offensive ones. No such grand offensive across the Alps had even been prepared in advance. Facing the Italians was the French Army of the Alps. At the outbreak of war in 1939, the French had approximately 550,000 men on this front, and had envisioned a swift preemptive strike if Italy was planning to join the war. This, however, did not materialise. In June 1940, the number of Frenchmen had dropped to 176,000 men, 83,000 of which were combat troops in the front line. On the 7th of June, their orders came in, and stated that if any Italian declaration of war did materialise, then they were to adopt a, quote, "completely defensive attitude, both on the ground and in the air," end quote. On the 10th, when Mussolini was giving his speech, General Mayer, head of the General Staff of the Army of the Alps, ordered bridges, roads, and railway tracks to be destroyed all the way along the frontier. The first few days of the war, however, were quiet. There was only patrol activity. On the 13th, a patrol of 40 French soldiers attacked a patrol of 5 Italian soldiers on the Maddalena Pass. It was here that a Lieutenant Laseta became the first casualty of the war, as he was returning fire at the French with his light machine gun. It was proposed that he be given a gold medal of military valour, but a year earlier his anti-fascist attitude had been noted, and so his family had to settle for him being given a silver medal instead. The following days saw a variety of artillery duels between the two sides near the town of Modane, but neither the French nor the Italians could boast of any significant success. Elsewhere, the French sent out more minor patrols which attacked their Italian counterparts, but none of these incidents did much for either side, and the intensity of the entire front remained very low. On the 14th, the French took their first casualty of the war as Jean Rigaud fell after being struck by a light machine gun fired by Alpini forces at Mount Capelet Superior. It was only on the 15th of June that Mussolini ordered his men to prepare for a major offensive into the Alps, preceded by aggressive actions to capture key positions in the border area. The window of opportunity was closing, and Mussolini knew that he had to act sooner rather than later. The Germans were flooding into France, and Paris had already fallen. There was no time to lose. Badoglio was ordered to begin the offensive on the 18th of June. This required the Italian troops to go from a defensive footing to an offensive footing in 3 days. Normally, this should have taken weeks, or even just shy of a month. On the 16th of June, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned, and Marshal Pétain took charge and spoke over the radio about the possibility of an armistice. The Lion of Verdun also wasted no time in reaching out to the Vatican to deliver the following note, quote, "The French government and its head, Marshal Pétain, ask His Holiness to provide the Italian government, in the shortest possible time, the information on our intention of finding a common platform for the establishment of a lasting peace between both countries." End quote. The Spanish embassy in France was asked to mediate too, and word was sent right to the British. For Mussolini, his world was essentially coming apart at the seams. Like a vulture, he had declared war to rip what he could from a collapsing France, and yet now it seemed as if the war would end before he could even capture any of his objectives. On the 17th of June at 6:10 p.m, the Italian General Staff had no choice but to issue a message temporarily suspending hostilities. The next day, Hitler and Mussolini met in Munich, and the Italians laid out their demands. Italy wanted to occupy France up to the Rhone River. Corsica, Tunisia, and Djibouti were to be ceded to Italy too. The Italians asked for the right to French naval bases in Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca, and for the French Air Force and Navy to be handed over to the Italians. They also asked for the right to occupy further areas belonging to France, too, be they metropolitan, colonial, or mandate territories. Mussolini, of course, had no grounds at all to make such demands, and all that he had to count on was Hitler's generosity. Elsewhere, Charles de Gaulle had turned up in London and announced that they would fight to the end with the British. To Hitler, this posed a potential disaster, and so he was left with only one logical option. The terms imposed on the French had to be generous, so as to not push the French into the arms of de Gaulle. The fleet, especially, was a worry. If the French were pushed too much, the Navy could seek refuge in their North African ports, or, even worse, British ports. A humiliation of France, too, would only make Britain fight harder, as that, in their eyes, would surely mean that the same was coming for them too, if they were to throw in the towel. Italy's demands were thus absolutely horrifying to Hitler, and threw him into a nightmare situation. Hitler's dream alliance had always been the British, not the Italians. In Hitler's mind, Germany would be the dominant power on the continent, whilst Britannia ruled the waves, and effectively the rest of the world. He was now left with a choice, and he was always going to choose the soft peace if it meant a chance at peace in the West. Italy's demands, which he had barely fought for, meant nothing to Hitler. After 2.5 hours of talks, Mussolini was effectively told he could keep as much land as he could capture. The Italians had, however, effectively brought peace to a halt until they too agreed to make peace. The Germans sent Pétain a response to his peace offers. Quote, "The government of the Reich informs that the agreement on the end of hostilities can only be discussed if the government of France contacts the government of Italy through the relevant Spanish government officials." End quote. The French, by now furious at the Italians for pouncing on them while they were down, were stern in their demands that Italy not be given anything. General Hunsinger explained, quote, "The Italians declared war on us, but they did not fight. If we meet in Rome with unacceptable demands, our agreement with the Germans will go to waste. You can crush us and hurt us even more. We will survive this, and we will not sign anything, and we will use the freedom of action that we have, because our Navy and Air Force are intact. Let what will be, be. We will do everything in our power. France has survived worse things. We believe that honour is worth more than life." End quote. The situation was now extremely complicated. Both Germany and Italy had to come to an individual agreement with France, and the armistice depended on successful negotiations with both. Italy was now left to conquer as much as she could before that day came about. On the 20th of June, Commando Supremo ordered an advance in all convenient directions. There was 3 of these, B meaning Little St. Bernard's Pass, M meaning Maddalena Pass, and R meaning the Ligurian Riviera. The Little St. Bernard's Pass was entrusted to the 4th Army, grouped between the Monte Rosa and the Monte Viso, the former being 4,634 metres above sea level, and the latter a little under 4,000. Guzzuini, the commander, believed the French to be utterly demoralised. The Germans were now in Chambéry. His opposite, General Orly, surely could only have kept a few subordinate troops facing the Italian front, given that the Germans could well attack from the rear soon. This was the case in his mind, at least. Guzzoni then duly moved his command post near the front, and expected little resistance. What he had not reckoned on, however, was the average French soldier's sheer hatred and anger at the Italians for their vulture-like declaration of war. They were willing to fight till the end, knowing they were doomed on the German front anyway. The night before the offensive set a record temperature of -20 degrees, and during the day itself, heavy snow covered the ground, and visibility was reduced to basically nil. These conditions were to last for an entire week, and various dirt roads, tourist trails, and mule paths turned into swamps. To top matters off, the area had barely been scouted by the Italians beforehand. The conditions, of course, also meant that supplies could not get through, and the aeronautica would become a non-factor. The Duce's men were essentially going in blind, and hoping that the imaginary French lack of morale alone would grant them a swift and easy victory. On the first day, however, the French artillery concentrated intense fire on the Italian positions, which they had clearly pre-prepared. The Italian artillery could do nothing and remained silent, otherwise they would be firing blind into the weather. Regardless, the Italians pushed forwards, but were quickly harassed by French machine guns. On the 22nd of June, one Frenchman made quite a name for himself. From Marek Sobski's Battle of the Alps, quote, Lieutenant Buell, desperate to hold off the Italians, performed a feat requiring extraordinary courage. He hung on a rope with an LMG at his hip, thanks to which he could machine gun a platoon of surprised enemy from a distance of barely 300 meters. The Frenchmen's fire from above caused havoc among the Italians. Only 3 of them survived the massacre. Buell safely returned to his cheering colleagues." End quote. Elsewhere, the weather itself was causing the Italians casualties in the form of avalanches. The next day, Lieutenant Buell's position came under heavy fire, and the defenders were in an extremely precarious situation. With no food and barely any supplies, the French, however, managed to hold on until the armistice against all odds. They alone managed to block the Italian advance any further in their vicinity. Elsewhere in the area, the Italians did score a victory. The Alpini of the Edilo Battalion were to capture the Belgrade position. After a mortar strike, a daring Italian assault began, in which the defenders held on for dear life. Ultimately, however, despite a heroic final stand, the position fell. Of the fall, and especially of the French commander, Sobski writes, quote, "Then De Castro came in, ordering them to return fire. The Frenchmen demonstrated great courage, firing with an LMG at the Alpini, who almost encircled the French positions. The lieutenant, wounded in his shoulder, discarded the LMG and continued to fight by shooting a pistol. An Alpini called De Castro to surrender, but he would not. Finally, one of the Italian bullets turned out to be fatal. The defence broke down, several Frenchmen went into captivity, the remainder withdrew, leaving an unspecified number of fallen. Italian losses are not known exactly, but they are referred to as light." End quote. The next position, named Seligis, however, was a tougher nut to crack due to it being a well-fortified part of the Maginot Line. The Italians had nothing to break the pillboxes with, and so decided to simply shoot at the slits. They, predictably, were met with a violent response, and then the French artillery opened up on them, forcing a hasty rethink in tactics. On the 24th, the gunners of the Alpini battery Bergamo brought up a howitzer with 100 rounds, without the help of mules, quite a feat in itself. They then prepared for the next day, where they were then to open up on the pillboxes. The armistice, however, would prevent this ever taking place. Elsewhere on the 24th, the Italians made little progress, as well-concentrated fortress artillery was able to simply blow them to pieces as they marched haphazardly into choke points. Smaller defensive positions seemed to be strongly armed with small and medium caliber artillery, as well as machine guns seemingly everywhere the Italians went to. The Italians, due to their lack of medium artillery, were unable to ever reply before the armistice. The Tridentina Alpini division in the region ended up losing 20 dead, 110 wounded, and 28 frostbitten between the 21st and 24th of June alone. They had very little to show for it. The attempt to get through the Little St. Bernard's Pass itself was chaotic in the extreme. Blunder after blunder seemed to take place, but the Italians did manage to successfully hit the Rouen redoubt fortifications with both artillery and bombers. On one day alone though, the 23rd of June, the Italians lost 10 tankettes trying to assault the fortress. The defenders, by now suffering from the cold and lack of supplies, were in a perilous situation, however. Luckily for the defenders, the weather deteriorated, and by the time it picked up, the armistice had been signed. The fortress held. On the 28th, after the armistice, Mussolini himself would visit the small St. Bernard's Pass, and the French flag was still clearly flying from the redoubt Rouen, even now, and the garrison was still there. Only on the 2nd of July did the commander receive written orders to leave the fort, and he did so. Quote, "Lieutenant Desauteaux wrote in his memoirs that he and his men experienced a seldom felt feeling as of 1940. We won our fight." End quote. When all was said and done, Operation B accomplished little. Despite having many times more troops than the French, the Italians were rebuffed time and time again, and suffered far heavier casualties than the French. The town of Meudon was vitally important, and both sides were well aware of this fact. The French had put 90 guns just in the area of the town, and the Italians were willing to throw all they had at it. Initially, it appeared as if the Italians might just be able to sweep up the town right away, and they captured a number of positions around it fairly quickly. The big artillery pieces in the town, however, quickly hampered their advance. Eventually, the French ended up retreating from the town itself, but the forts were ordered to defend it until the last, and the armistice came into play before it fell. The advance on the town was at times brutal in the extreme. The French fortifications were extremely formidable, and tank after tank was torn to shreds by their big guns. The Italians tended to advance along the most obvious routes too, and so French gunners partook in what was essentially a turkey shoot at times, in which the Italians would be left with no choice but to retreat. The Italians' own artillery, or at least the very little of it that was able to function in such conditions, were unable to crack the armoured French positions. Sobski describes a typical example of how such Italian advances went. The third column was divided into two smaller ones. The 1st 91st Infantry Regiment headed towards Gros-Outrage-la-Voie, and the 3rd 91st moved through the Col de Fréjus Pass to Petit Ouvrard Arrondat and Gros Ouvrard Pas de Roc. The entire action broke down in the early hours of the 21st of June. The advance of the first of the columns was stopped by fire from Gros Ouvrage-la-Voie. On the French side of the Fréjus Pass, the advance of the second of the battalions was halted by the French advanced defensive position located there. The Italians were trying to outflank the obstacle by climbing on the Mount Chime du Grand Vallon, and they were met by fortress artillery, shelling, as well as mortar fire from Petit Ouvrage Arrondat. The battalion suffered losses and was trapped without the possibility to retreat. The move forward was held up by a huge rock cliff. Retreat was impossible due to the extremely accurate fire of the artillery. At night, a blizzard raged over the Italian positions, as a result of which dozens of soldiers suffered from frostbite. The trapped men remained in the same place until the armistice." End quote. One division in particular was utterly crippled by the attack on Modane, that being the Superga. In this division alone, there was 1,290 soldiers suffering from frostbite, and in many cases, one or both feet had to be amputated. The Italians were woefully underprepared for such matters, and many lives were kindly saved by the French, as they allowed the Italians to use the hospitals in Chambéry and Grenoble, where the men were able to receive proper, modern care. Beforehand, the entire Superga division had merely 4 ambulances. Overall, in the Modane area, there had been 40,000 Italians attacking 13,000 Frenchmen. The former lost, according to the French, 108 dead and an incalculable number of frostbitten and wounded, well over 1,000. The French, for their part, lost 4 dead, 21 wounded and frostbitten, and 63 soldiers taken prisoner. The differences in losses is extreme, but hardly surprising. The French were in heavily fortified positions, whilst the Italians were forced to attack along the select few routes, in which the French had heavy fortress artillery ready and waiting. The weather, too, was barely a factor for the French, compared to the Italians, who had to actually brave it. The south was perhaps where a swift advance mattered more than anywhere else. Nice, most importantly, was on the south coast, and Mussolini was terrified that the Germans would seize the vital city first. The Alpini were given the task of crossing the mountainous terrain to get there from above, and the attack commenced at 9:30 on the 22nd of June after a brief artillery barrage. By the end of that day, some of the Alpini units easily reached their goals with little to no resistance. Others, however, swiftly came under heavy fire from the deeply entrenched French in their shelters, especially in the Lake Parois area. Soon enough, little to no progress was being made, and the Italians were starving as very few supplies were able to get through. When anything at all could get through, ammunition was prioritised over food. On top of this, the frostbite casualties continued to roll in. On the 24th, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 44th Infantry Regiment launched a great assault upon Fort Virias, which had been harassing them for days. The weather hadn't really let up, but regardless, it had to be done. Despite being fired at by LMGs and mortars, the mountain was scaled on which the fort was sat. The infantry were able to sneak up onto the buildings and then threw hand grenades down upon them. A violent close-quarters battle then ensued, in which the Italians were beginning to gain the upper hand. The French, however, made their last gamble and called upon their own artillery to fire on the fortress. Soon enough, the attackers' enthusiasm waned. The French gamble had paid off, and they had managed to avoid any casualties from their own artillery. To add insult to injury, the Italians were then taken prisoner, 333 of them. The fort, however, was encircled, and remained so until the armistice. Elsewhere on the 24th, the Bolzano Alpini battalion was advancing, and came straight under the guns of the French outpost Col de Fréjus. 2 SES platoons also spotted them and began to light them up with their machine guns, catching the Italians in a deadly crossfire. The ground became littered with corpses, and a panic ensued as the survivors fled for their lives. Some Italian artillery pieces managed to return fire, and only then were the Bolzanos able to make good their escape. Pretty much all other attacks met the same fate, and the story became a repetitive one for the Italian First Army. The French defences were formidable in the extreme, and morale dropped off a cliff as suicidal attack after suicidal attack was ordered. The First Army had deployed 52,000 soldiers, whilst the French defenders had a mere 15,000. Italian losses were 127 killed, 1,526 wounded and frostbitten, and 399 taken prisoner. The French, for their part, had 4 dead and 5 wounded. The entire ordeal had been a complete humiliation. In the far south on the French-Italian border lays the town of Menton. Further still, down the coast is Nice, which has been mentioned. Operation R, as it was known, was left to the 15th Army Corps. General Gambara, their commander, was given the task of occupying Menton, then Nice, and then setting the new border on the Var River. Here, due to the less mountainous terrain, the Air Force was actually able to come into play, and the attack was preceded by a bombing run. Artillery support, however, was still abysmal. The French, for their part, had their usual strong fortifications, and perhaps as many as 400 big guns. The weather here was less of a factor too. The sources conflict, with the Italians insisting there was snow, but ultimately photographs seem to prove that the snow was in no way a factor during these coastal operations. On the night of the 22nd, 23rd of June, there was a planned amphibious landing, which was to be put ashore between Menton and Cap Martin, with the goal of surprising and outflanking the French defenders. Issues immediately arose, however. There was no suitable landing craft, and so fishing boats of all things were collected, and on the 22nd, the improvised force was put to sea. Things immediately began to go wrong. Several boats went aground. The engines of others simply gave out as they couldn't take the excessive load, and even worse, the fog made it impossible to see the approaches to the beach. It was decided to postpone the operation to the following evening. The weather, however, got worse, not better. The operation was abandoned. Of the first objective itself, Menton, Sobski writes, quote, "Capturing the town of Menton, which in 1940 had a population of 21,700, in most part dependent on which side controlled the coastal route. Here, however, the attack from the Italian border met a serious problem. The boundary ran from the mouth of the stream San Luigi to the sea, north towards the Pont Saint Louis bridge. Here, the French had located less than 50 metres from the border the strong point, advanced post de Pont Saint Louis, which was completed in 1934. The position was hammered into the rock, just in front of the bridge connecting the two countries." End quote. At 8 AM on the 20th of June, 7 Italians seized the border inspection post by the bridge, and they were followed up by 200 infantrymen. They then attempted to break through the steel barrier blocking the bridge. Lieutenant Gros, the leader of the 9-strong French crew holding the forward position, called for artillery support, and the attackers quickly ran for cover. Many Italian patrols went around the bridge, clambering down the canyon and then back up again on the other side. The French, however, held their nerve and repelled attack after attack with small arms fire and hand grenades. Operations essentially ceased for 2 days in this area. On the 22nd of June, the hour-long Italian artillery bombardment that morning failed to silence the fortifications on the French first line of defence. The bridge was not the only route to advance down, however, it was a major one. Elsewhere, the Italians were advancing towards Menton, and a successful attack was launched in the area of Garavan Boulevard in Menton itself, and the French were forced to beat a hasty retreat at 6 PM. Italians began to pour into the streets, but met countless obstacles and damaged road infrastructure. A few houses were captured, but then French fortifications halted any more progress in its tracks. The Italians paid dearly for those few houses, suffering 22 dead, 73 wounded, and 3 missing. On the 23rd, the mountains and hills surrounding Menton were captured by the Italians, and bloody house-to-house fighting continued. Elsewhere, the Pont Saint Louis bridge was attacked again from both sides. The Italians got as close as 3 metres away from the fortification, tossing hand grenades as they went. The 9 Frenchmen, however, held their ground in a Spartan-like fashion, and this too was repelled. Menton itself, however, was almost deserted by the French by that evening. Most noticeably, the Senegalese troops in the area barely put up a fight and simply surrendered, leaving the French civilians to their fate. On the 24th, another attack was launched on the Cap Martin fortification, in which the Italians pulled out all the stops. They began to place explosives, but were shelled to pieces, and so the engineers were chased away. During the fighting, overall, the fortification took 1,500 hits from the Italian guns and mortars. On the 23rd, in 45 minutes alone, 300 rounds found their target. Despite this, the 9 men of Cap Martin held firm, and the Italians suffered far more losses here than anywhere else. The Maginot Line was proving it was well worth the money, at least on the Italian front. Sobski writes of how the story ended, quote, "The resistance of the Pont Saint Louis position was particularly troubling for the Italians. In the evening, the fortification was bombarded by a battery of 210 and 260mm mortars. In response, fortress artillery from Gros Ouvrage d'Artillerie du Mont Agel and other neighbouring batteries fired at the railway station, in Ventimiglia, and other targets. In the evening, the fire intensified. As in other sectors, the French were firing away their ammunition supply. At 1:35 AM on the 25th of June, the struggle stopped. However, the Italians suffered 2 unnecessary casualties. At 6 AM on the 25th of June, Italian soldiers, certain that no one would shoot at them anymore, tried to remove the barrier opposite the Pont Saint Louis position. However, a French burst killed the platoon commander, Mario Lalli, who was posthumously awarded with the MOVM, as well as Private Giuseppe Pud. It was only after 8:45 AM when the Italians flew a large-size white flag, and the Italian colonel of the engineers turned out for negotiations. Second Lieutenant Gros came over, who had heard confirmation of the armistice from 2 French liaison officers. The heroic crew remained in the position for 2 days more before it was finally evacuated. In the evening, on the 26th of June, the barrier blocking the bridge was finally removed, and the first ambulances rushed to help. On the 1st of July, 1940, the ruined Menton was visited by Mussolini, Marshal Badoglio, and General Gambara. End quote. In the area, the Italians had brought 80,000 troops to battle against 38,000 Frenchmen. The Italians suffered over 200 dead, 856 wounded and frostbitten, and 106 prisoners. The French, meanwhile, suffered 10 dead, 32 wounded, and 23 prisoners. The highlight of the entire ordeal had of course been the Pont Saint Louis position, in which the French, with just 9 men, inflicted horrific losses upon the Italians, whilst not even taking a casualty of their own. They were able to hold their heads high as they were taken into captivity after the armistice. The Italians had begun their offensive, as noted, to grab as much territory as possible whilst the peace negotiations were already taking place. As the talks went on, the French were amazed that the Italians were suddenly only demanding the tiny strips of land they had managed to capture. This, of course, was Hitler's doing. On top of that, the Italians suddenly dropped the demand that all Italian political refugees be removed from France. The atmosphere of the negotiations had totally changed too. If anything, it was friendly. Upon the signing of the armistice at 7:15 p.m. on the 24th of June, Marshal Badoglio said to General Hunziker of France, quote, "I hope that France will be reborn. It is a great nation, with a great story, and with a great future in front of her. I sincerely wish it to happen." End quote. At 1:35 a.m. on the 25th of June, the war between France and Italy officially ended. Only Great Britain remained in the fight. On the 7th of July, the occupation zones were announced. The first zone, the so-called Green Line, consisted of the areas that the Italian troops had reached before the armistice came into force. These were to be fully occupied by Italy, and the fortifications manned by Italian troops. 50 kilometers west of the Green Line was to be the Purple Line. The area between green and purple was to be demilitarized, and access only granted to members of the Disarmament Committee. In practice, the Italians now occupied a strip of territory that ranged from a few hundred meters to a maximum of 15 kilometers in depth. The total area was 832 kilometers squared, with a population of 82,523 people, 21,700 of which were in the town of Menton itself. On the 10th of July, the French Army of the Alps was officially disbanded, and General Orly bade farewell to his subordinates and thanked them for their courageous service. In terms of overall losses, the two sides were worlds apart. The Italians suffered 39 officers and 592 men killed, 138 officers and 2,493 men wounded, 23 officers and 593 men missing, and 26 officers and 2,125 men frostbitten. During the course of the campaign, 616 Italians had been taken into French captivity too. The French, meanwhile, lost 37 dead, 62 wounded, and 153 taken prisoner. Other sources put the number killed as low as 20. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this shorter video, and if you did, then please do leave a like, it helps a lot. For those of you that don't know, these videos are in preparation for a gigantic Complete Life of Benito Mussolini video, which will be coming in a few videos time, so please do stay tuned for that. Thank you.